Welcome to week 5. This week's discussion really focuses on the research design process, so I thought that I'd offer you a summary of the major components of survey design and the considerations that you have to take into account when you're conducting research. For that reason, the majority of your test questions will come from this week's lecture. Remember, if you find that you're writing down just the words on the slides, you're not going to do well. It's important that you listen for definitions, examples, and discussion and take notes most especially on those. A couple of quick reminders for the week. Remember that your poll critique is due at the end of this week for your groups. This means that each person in the group needs to find a poll related to your topic and analyze it. In the assignments heading, you'll find the full description of the assignment expectations, but the bottom line for this particular assignment is that 1, as a group you have to decide on a consistent way that you're going to evaluate the polls that you found. In the last several weeks, we've talked about a lot of the issues from presentation of data, response rates, the interpretation of data, and this week, the art of designing effective surveys. You can select any 2 to 3 criteria that you think are important, but you need to make sure that everyone in the group is applying the same criteria to each of the polls that you find. Second, the evaluations of the polls themselves needs to be fairly concise, around a half page to a page each, but specifically needs to address how the poll does or doesn't meet the 2 to 3 criteria the group established as a way to judge what a good poll is. And 3, as a group, discuss the implications. The real purpose of this implications section is that you're trying to build a case for conducting a public opinion survey. So there should be some strengths to the polls that you find, but also weaknesses or information just not addressed that you think is important to consider. Finally, as a part of this, you need to specify variables that you think are important to your topic. These can be either independent or dependent variables. Remember, independent variables are those that cause something to change, and dependent variables are the things that are changed. In public opinion polls, for example, with BP, an independent variable could be BP's public relations responses, and a dependent variable could be the public's perception of BP's willingness to compensate people. These should be reasoned judgment calls on your group's part to decide what you think is important for people to know about your topic based on information that we don't yet have about public opinion. All right, so as we start to look at the components of this process, this just gives you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. The survey design process is a challenge, but also one that gets at the heart of designing good research to discover good information about public opinion. If we look at the research process itself, there are 4 basic needs. First, you have the needs of the client. Basically, the client is interested in something like, I want answers to my problem. So when you're designing research, you have really 3 questions to consider. First, are they after results that measure something? Second, is the client after results that help guide them to make a decision? And third, is the client after results that help them generate ideas? What is their purpose? So you have to understand the problem, you have to understand the purpose. Be very clear about what you're trying to achieve for whom, and then work backwards. If you go next down clockwise to the needs of the respondents, think about what respondents want, the people who participate in your survey. They basically want a short, relevant, clear survey that gives them room to express their true opinions. So there are 2 components to think about here. First, you have to deliver an experience that respects where they're at. That means that it's really the fact that they're neither stupid nor tolerant of being bored. So that's the experience you have to deliver. You have to speak to their level without talking down to them, and you have to make them interested in it. And second, that we as researchers have to communicate. That means to instruct, to ask, and to listen in a manner that is clear and as unambiguous as possible for the respondents. If we keep moving down clockwise, we come to the needs of the field. These are the needs of the field refers to the people who are actually conducting the research. So what the field needs really are is a clear roadmap that assists in communicating clearly. Think about it this way. For the field team, no matter whether this is the people doing phone surveys, the folks putting together and managing the online surveys, or face-to-face interviews, you need, as the research designer, to deliver a document that acts as a well-designed roadmap that allows them to contact the right people and then doesn't lead anyone astray or into annoyance in any way. So there are three components to meet the needs of the field. First, it needs to identify who the field researchers should be talking to. Second, it needs to find a way to filter out those that you don't want to talk to. And third, it needs to identify and work with the limits of the field research process and those limits that they put on the questionnaire design. So, for example, length, language, and the ability to show pictures, etc., are challenges and limitations depending on the mode of survey delivery. So you as the researcher have to identify and work within those limits to give the field researcher something that they can actually use. And then if you look at the fourth component there, the analyst's needs. Basically what an analyst needs, and by the way, the field and the analyst could be you as well. So these are just the components broken out. So what the analyst needs is data that is structured in a way that's useful to answer questions or to test hypotheses. For the analyst, we need to design a document that generates data of the highest quality, thorough questions that are relevant and meaningful. That's the most important part. You have to have questions that are focused. You can't just ask random questions. Every question that you ask needs to have a specific research purpose to it. So you need to know, first of all, what the analysis is going to look like. Second, what format that the analyst would need the data in. And third, ask whether or not they have a while to work with the data or just a real short time frame. So if you think about poll writing or survey writing, you're really sitting smack dab in the middle. That is the world of the survey or the poll writer. You have to manage the intersection of the client, the respondent, the field, and the analyst's needs. If you can, then you're going to design a pretty successful survey. If you don't, well, you probably won't. So to help break this down a little bit more clearly, I want you to take a look for a moment at the whole research process. It is definitely a linear process, but one that also comes back on itself. So first, you have to clearly define the research need. What is the purpose? That's what really my comments for your topic selection paper focused on, is that you have to establish a very focused and specific need for the research. Likewise, the problem. Who this is a problem for, what interest, what specific issue that you're going to address. In those first two steps, if you don't have a really tight handle on the purpose, who the stakeholders are, for whom something is a problem, then the rest of the research really falls by the wayside. In the third component, you're talking about the research design. This is putting it together. This is what should we do? Who do we need to reach out to? Who are our publics that we want to survey? From there, you get into the specifics of sampling and data collection, analyzing, and then finally reporting. Then, really, at the end of the reporting, you're never going to have a perfect survey. We've talked about that. So then you identify what needs you still have. So the real take-home point here is that regardless of the client purpose or mode of the survey delivery, this is the process for conducting public opinion research, really any scientific research. But keep this process in mind. Understand how all of the components fit together. So the research process, then, if we put it into a professional context, we have to understand that the questionnaire is key to this whole context. What I want you to notice are a few things about this adaptation of the traditional research process into a professional context. Evaluating public opinion. Notice that one of the most important components here is that evaluating public opinion is very goal-directed. At each stage of the design process, the designer has to consider whether the survey is meeting the goals. That's why I was such a stickler in evaluating your week 3 assignment, is that you really have to have those goals clear so that the whole thing works. The other thing that I really wanted to highlight about this process is that it absolutely has to be geared towards your targeted respondents, because they have to buy into it. And this lets you first get the responses to begin with, get participants, and second, get good rich data. I did for years market research phone surveys, and so being one of the field people, I found it was much easier to talk to people and get them to answer surveys about topics they were interested in. So, for example, I could do a 2-hour, heaven forbid, but a 2-hour survey on golfing equipment to avid golfers, or I could talk about alcohol choices, a 20-minute survey, get alcohol choices related and connected to almost anyone. Talking about health insurance, however, was a much harder sell to keep people on the phone unless they were particularly angry about something that had happened. So how involved people are really makes it a lot easier to get respondents and to get quality data out of them. Think about it this way. You need to make your topics sexy and engaging for your respondents because you're taking up their time. And if you're doing the surveys either on the phone or online, it's really easy for your respondent to end the survey and you lose those responses. Bottom line, if they're not interested, you're just not going to get good data. That's really the way to understand this research process. So as we shift gears into the questionnaire design, I want you to keep in mind that there are really 2 types of surveys. One is the self-administered, meaning the respondent kind of handles the whole process by themselves. The second are the interviewer administered. So self-administered include mail, delivered and collected surveys, and internet-based surveys. The interview administrated surveys are telephone and face-to-face. So understanding what type of a survey that you're designing affects the design choices that you both can and should make. There's a lot of difference in what you can do with respondents when you're there to control this situation and the interaction and when you're not. We'll talk a little bit about mode considerations throughout, but remember these are important considerations as you're designing the overall survey. So if we take a look at the different parts of a survey, you always have to have an informed consent statement or agreement. Remember, no matter the research that you're doing, you have to give your respondents enough information about the project that they can determine whether it's in their best interests to participate. This is also a great opportunity to establish the study's credibility, get respondent interest in them, and really try and connect the relevance of the survey to your respondents themselves. So there are 7 things that the informed consent statement ought to include, and this is really a review of last week. But first, it needs to include a brief statement of who you are, that you're a credible researcher after credible ends. Second, it needs to clearly indicate the purpose of the survey. Third, the letter needs to describe what's involved. Fourth, you absolutely have to include any risks, costs, or rewards. Fifth, You need to explain how the results will be used, and for a lot of folks, very importantly, whether their name can ever be attached to the survey or not after they complete it. Sixth, you need to emphasize that the survey is voluntary, both at the very beginning and also throughout. And seventh, you're going to want to include an assortment of random information depending on your survey, but things like how to obtain the results, contact details, complaints, etc., etc. The second thing or part of your survey is that you need to provide survey instructions. You need to make sure that while you're trying to simplify the process, that you're not treating your respondents like simpletons, but in general providing clear instructions about what the respondent is supposed to do at the very beginning and also at the beginning of each section will accomplish three things. First, it will provide you with more consistent results. Second, it will improve responses. Few people will actually read the survey without good prompting and easy to read instructions. And third, it's just an explanation of how to do the survey in a very user-friendly manner. And then third, you want to plan the order, flow, and structure of your survey. I'm going to talk a lot about this in just a minute, but think about it this way. You need to manage the flow of the survey, how the questions are grouped, what they look like, how it's presented. We'll get into this in much more detail in just a moment. But as we're looking at the questionnaire design, part of this third part, the planning the order, flow, and structure, is to manage the flow of the process. So if you take a look at this, the real question is why do we need to manage the flow? So first, the component on here that probably needs the most explaining is creating the smooth cognitive pathway. Put more simply, confusing your participants is a bad thing. You want the respondents to feel comfortable and confident as they're responding to the questions, so you need to do everything that you can visually, via instructions and ordering of your questions to keep it simple and easy to follow. But just as important as I mentioned before, you also need to keep the survey interesting or stimulating for your participants. If your participants are really into the survey and you pace it well, you can get away with a bit of a longer survey. So in part this is based on how engaged you think your target population will be with the topic, but it's also about making the questions interesting and making the respondents feel like they're contributing to something meaningful. So by doing these first two things in the design of your survey, you'll do the third, to maximize the completion rate. In week 3, a few of you pointed out in the forums how you couldn't believe such a small response rate, that was all right, that 60% seemed just a bad idea in order to base responses on and to say, oh, this is what people actually think. I know at the outset it seems pretty obvious that really you would want to get like a 90+% response rate, but that's not terribly realistic. What you want to make sure, though, is that you've done everything you can to get as many people to participate as possible. It's increasingly difficult, by the way, to get people to respond to surveys, mostly because we're just surveyed to death, but only in part because people aren't interested in a lot of the topics. The second outcome to the good design from creating the smooth cognitive pathway and creating a good experience is that ultimately we improve the quality of our data. When it comes to public opinion, as we've seen in our cases and in the discussion from the first 4 weeks, this is clearly an important component. Anything that we can do to improve that quality is going to be critical. So one of the most important things that you can do is to manage the length of your questionnaire. So there are 3 really pretty short principles to think about. First, keep it brief. Most of the time we figure that once we have them, we may as well cram everything possible into the survey. I've written some hellishly long surveys. The thing is, though, this is only going to reduce your response rate. What you really want to do is ask the bare minimum number of questions that you need in order to accomplish the goals that you have for your survey. Second, be linear. One of the big mistakes that a lot of people make is when they're trying to keep their survey interesting, they'll hop around to different topics in a way that just doesn't make sense. The rule of thumb is that you want to start with the broadest topics you have first, and then narrow as you move deeper into the survey. For example, if you're trying to get market opinion, you might start with a broad category of goods or services, get people's opinion on them, then move to different brands, and then move to specific brands that you're actually interested in. If you do this, you'll help the cognitive flow. And third, if you have long or difficult sections, change up the activity so there's a rhythm to the experience. For example, if you have somewhat of a repetitive task in your questionnaire, make a section that is a bit of a breather activity, something interactive, something more interesting. I'll give you an example in a little bit, but something that's easier and lighter that helps you transition into your next survey. Into your next activity. So if you keep the length under control, then you also want to make sure as you're designing it that you use verbal or visual signposts. And really you want to do this for 4 reasons. First, very simply, it clearly communicates the structure of your survey. If you all have ever driven along the road and not been able to find street signs, you know how annoying and confusing it is. Think about that translated into a survey. If your participant does not know where to go, does not understand the instructions, they're just going to give up and quit. Second, let the respondents know that they're making progress. On online surveys, if you all have taken any, you'll notice that a lot of the times they'll have the little progress bar, 25% complete, 30% complete, whatever it is. Even on pen and paper, no matter the way that you deliver the survey, you want to do something like that. You want to let the respondents know that they're making progress. Third, set localized expectations. What this means is question 1 of 3, question 2 of 3. If you have it online, that's the way to help them understand where the survey is going, how much longer they have left. You can also do that in the pen and paper type of survey, and definitely face-to-face you want to do this. And finally, you want to provide encouragement. You want to, anything that you can, whether it's interviewer focused or pen and paper, you want to really make sure that they feel involved throughout the process, that you thank them for their time continually, you emphasize the importance and that they're contributing to something useful. So, when you have all of these components, these are really the basics of it. And as we transition then, let's take a look at how the surveys are actually laid out. This is an example of what's called a pretty standard battery of questions. Basically, a battery of questions is a big hunk of questions, all with the same kind of responses laid out there. And this is pretty standard in a lot of self-administered kinds of questionnaires in particular. But there are 3 reasons that when you can, you want to avoid them. First, they're tiresome. Look, they just take time and they're onerous. This is where the perception of difficulty and the length of the survey can hurt both the response rate and your dropout rates. The dropout rate is people who start the survey and then just stop somewhere in the middle. Also, one thing I've noticed is that researchers will ask long batteries of questions, especially online, and then you have to scroll up to find the anchors. The anchors are the strongly agree, neutral, somewhat disagree, etc. That is a pain in the butt. You get into, your third internet page of a survey and you're trying to scroll up to remember which one it is. That's really annoying, and it reduces the response rates as well as the reliability, because if people forget which end of the scale is which, you might just get bad results. Second, it encourages satisficing. Satisficing behaviors are those where folks are just filling in responses to complete the survey. The satisficing theory suggests that respondents will tend to assume that the main option is probably the correct option, so the easiest response is to simply agree. Not only is this a really passive way to have people respond to a survey, this means that they're much less likely to actually think about the questions. So again, this hurts your reliability and your validity. And then the final component is anchoring effects. That is a troublesome part of it. Basically, your answer to the first question, what the anchoring effects argue is that the answer to your first question influences the answers for the rest of the battery. There are lots of reasons for this, but people like consistency. So if they pick one answer to start, for example, strongly agree, they'll often want to stick with that response. Again, this minimizes the validity and the reliability of your polls. So let me give you an example of an alternative to the battery of questions. Make it visual. The exercise above is basically a matching exercise. Right now it's set up for an online kind of survey, but you could do this in a pen and paper type of survey as well. Think about it like a matching test, where you have the 4 brands on one side and the words on the other. So on a pen and paper, you could just have the respondents draw lines or put in numbers, anything like that. Now this kind of a survey would not work well on the phone or where the respondent can't see and do the exercise visually. But online and for pen and paper, the idea is that you get folks to answer the same kinds of questions as giant batteries, but with 3 advantages over the batteries. First, whoa, hi Batman. First, okay, pardon me, these are more intuitive. Because for each of your test products, people can see the brands laid out, they can see the words, and they can choose whether or not they think it applies. The basic scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree can be really awkward for some questions and some topics. This lets people make simpler decisions that are genuinely more comparative. Second, these actually handle more data. Because the visual layout, what you see here on a single page with a lot of happy flowing white space is also asking a ton of questions. Think about the battery layout from the page before. For each of those brands, if you asked a battery of questions, you'd ask a scale question, and so if you look at what's on this page, you'd end up with 80 questions. Imagine what that would look like. This asks the same as those 80 questions, but in a much shorter format and lets your respondent actually compare much more easily. So not only can you ask more questions in an easier way, but you end up getting different kinds of responses and impressions depending on how you set up the question. For example, these could be mutually exclusive. So you could take hip hop and only allow it to be used to describe one of these 4 brands. Or you could make it a multiple response. That is, you take hip hop and, if a respondent thought it applied to Jack Daniels, to the bourbon cola, or Jim Beam, whatever, to all of them, you could just drop hip hop in all of those or draw a line to all of them. So you can do a lot of different things if you lay it out this way rather than in some big ugly battery. Finally, these are much more active. Remember on the last slide, I talked about having passive responses hurt your validity and hurt your reliability. Well, people can't really be passive because they're actually having to draw lines or drag and drop something. They can't just be mindlessly filling in blanks, circle numbers, or check boxes. So this improves the quality of your data and help keeps your respondents interested in the poll. This is important, especially in those self-administered online and pen and paper polls that have a high dropout rate or a high non-completion rate. So make it visual whenever possible and whenever it makes sense. Now, if we want to take a look at this in a big picture setting, You want to make sure that you understand the kinds of decisions that have to be made when you're putting your questionnaires together. There are really two goals, the first of which is questionnaire accuracy. So you want to make sure that your questionnaire measures the concepts and the issues that you actually intend it to. The second is relevancy, is that each question needs to have information gathered that explicitly addresses a stated research objective. So you got to measure what you're supposed to, and you have to make sure it matters. So the 5 critical decisions are, first, that the questions that you ask are actually needed. Don't ask things that you're just interested in or you think might be kind of cool to know. A lot of times, a lot of researchers will do this. But if it's not accurate and it's not relevant, cut it out. Second, make sure that your question phrasing is clear. Run it by people who are in the same demographic as your target population. Third, you want to make sure that your question sequence is productive. It makes sense, it's interesting, it keeps the pace going. Fourth, you want to make sure that your questionnaire layout is helpful. Like we just said, if you can make it a little bit more visual, great. If you have happy flowing white space, even better. And then the last component is that you try the thing out before you go to the time and the effort to launch the whole study. Get a few folks to respond and see what the problems are, see what you need to do in order to make it better. So what a lot of this will come down to is asking good questions. These are really the 5 principal goals you have when you're writing a poll, a single question. So every single question that you ask needs to meet these 5 goals. So what's the right way to ask a question? First, you have to have the clear and consistent instructions. Second, each question needs to have unambiguous wording and intent. You don't want to leave it up to the respondent to interpret. That's bad. Because for any single thing, there could be 1,000 interpretations. You want to make sure that your goal, your intent is clear, replicable, testable. Third, you want to generate usable and high-quality data. It has to be in a structure and a format that can be helpful. Fourth, each question has to be manageable by the respondent and allows them to truthfully answer. I'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of what bad questions are not manageable and don't really allow for a truthful response. And fifth, is it ethical, fair, and you got to make sure that it doesn't compromise any stakeholder. I'll give you a moment to write those down. All right, so let's take a look at some examples of questions and we really some of the pluses and the minuses and what types of questions you can ask. So we start out with the open-ended question. Yes, because dogs are too cute, especially this one. So open-ended questions basically pose some problem and ask the respondent to answer in their own words. Your goal if you're asking open-ended questions is to get the respondent talking. So if we look at a couple of examples, what do you like most about your job? Or what comes to mind when you look at this advertisement? Notice they're very vague, they're very general. These types of open-ended questions, by the way, are great icebreaker questions. If you come to an interview, and a research interview, and you sit down, if you're talking about job satisfaction, that first one would be great. If you're talking about market research, the second one would be great. So the advantages to open-ended questions is first, they're most useful in exploratory research, especially where we really don't know what the public opinion might be about our topic. They're also great because they can reveal unanticipated reactions towards a product, an issue, whatever it might be. And third, they allow respondent warm-up. Like I just mentioned, they're great first questions because they allow respondents to warm up to the questioning. Think about it like an icebreaker. But they also have some disadvantages. First, they can be expensive to administer because they require interaction with an interviewer and they take longer, they're more expensive. You can use open-ended questions on paper or internet surveys, but they're typically not terribly successful there. People will just skip them. So they're best applied in phone surveys or face-to-face interactions. Second is interviewer bias potential. Because your interviewer, the researcher, has the potential to react to responses, might not stay in script, or any number of subtle, usually experience-related issues, it's easy to introduce interviewer bias. Even in the most sincere efforts, just to have a conversation with someone, we can subtly direct the respondents, or at least they perceive that. So if we're nodding, "Oh, that's interesting, tell me more," they might think that you think that they're answering the right way. And that's the thing. Most participants want to help you out. That's why they're participating. So you can easily direct them without actually knowing them. And finally, you can get a longer answer bias. What this means is that longer answers get coded. All of your answers get coded, get interpreted, what have you. So if you have in a group of interviews really long and very well detailed responses, those individuals actually end up affecting the overall results just because of the sheer amount of information they compared against other people. So you can end up with a disproportionate view of a particular topic if you're not careful about it. The second type of basic question are fixed alternative questions. Multiple choice, any number. So let's take a look at these. Fixed alternative questions are those in which the respondent is given specific, limited alternative responses and asked to choose one that's closest to their own viewpoint. So the first type of these, and we'll talk about 5 different types, the first one are simple dichotomy questions. These require the respondent to choose between 2 alternatives, that is, a yes or no question. For example, did you make any long-distance calls last week? The second type is determinant choice question. These require the respondent to choose one response from among multiple alternatives. For example, are you Democrat, Republican, Green, Independent, other, etc., etc. But they're still finite. You're still giving them a specific group of possible options to which they can respond. The third type are checklist questions. These allow the respondent the ability to provide multiple answers to a single question by checking off different items. They're really useful when you're asking about behaviors people have ever engaged in, products people purchase, things like that. You just have to make sure that no 2 responses would contradict one another. So, for example, a question like, check the following stores you have bought electronics from in the last year: Apple, Mac, Target, Best Buy, Walmart, or other. So you want to make sure that the checklist is exhaustive. If you're only interested in, for example, those 4, the Apple, Mac, Target, Best Buy, and Walmart, you still need to include other, just to see if they have bought in the last year, but just not from them. The fourth type are scale questions. These ask people the strength of their beliefs. For example, do you strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly disagree, or the frequency with which a respondent performs a behavior. So, for example, if I asked how often do you play World of Warcraft, the scale might be daily, 3 to 6 times per week, 1 to 2 times per week, once a month, or never. With scale questions, what you're interested in is the difference between those actual levels. So these first three types of questions, the simple dichotomy, determinant choice, and checklist questions, really only focus on questions of fact. Scale questions start to get into questions of beliefs, values, or behaviors, much more so and in much more detailed ways than the first three types. The last type also, like the scale questions, focus on beliefs, values, and behaviors. A semantic differential question is one that is designed to measure the connotative meaning behind concepts. So the respondent is asked to choose whether his or her opinion lies on a scale between two bipolar adjectives. For example, if we were interested in studying President Obama's performance and we wanted to use a semantic differential scale, on one end we would have adequate, on the other end inadequate, and your respondent would choose among a scale of anywhere from completely inadequate to extremely adequate, whatever you wanted to put. But it focuses on those ending points only. The middle ones aren't really defined. It's just that it goes to the strength of the opinion versus like the scale saying strongly agree, agree, disagree. The semantic differential does not have that. They would just have blanks put in for with the anchors on each on the ends. So semantic differentials can be used to not only describe people, but connotative meanings of concepts. The semantic differential is probably the most widely used scale in the measurement of attitudes today. One of the reasons is just the versatility. The bipolar adjective pairs can be used to study a really big variety of subjects. So overall, when we look at types 1 through 5, when we're looking at fixed alternative questions, there are some advantages and some disadvantages. The first advantage is that they can be used in any kind of a mode. They require less interviewer skill. For interviews and phone surveys, basically if someone can read, they can do them. For pen and paper or the respondent types of the respondent-based types of questionnaires, they can just handle it themselves. Second, they take less time because they're not dependent on conversation. They're just quicker. Third, respondents know what answers are expected. They can pick an answer versus trying to explain what they think or what they've done. Sometimes our memory on an instant recall isn't as good as if we're cued. And fourth, the responses are easier to compare because there are a limited number of predictable categories. But there are a couple of disadvantages as well. First, the range of responses can be limited, but there's a lot of reasons that you'll see middle of the road or don't know or even other as different types of possible responses, and is to make the questions exhaustive. It's important because you'd rather have someone fill in a less useful, for example, no opinion response, rather than just not answer the question at all. So in week 3, for example, some folks had said that the Daily Coast poll should eliminate the not sure response, but that's why it's there. It's to make sure that they get at least some kind of a response, because missing data where someone doesn't actually answer the question becomes a statistical problem versus just a less useful response with something like no opinion, not sure, etc. So that's why you want to use exhaustive category responses with fixed alternative questions. However, just to problematize this, there are findings that also suggest that people who don't offer an opinion typically have one. So if you remove the option, you can encourage a more thoughtful answer. The problem is that you may not have an exhaustive set of options to really encapsulate people's opinions or genuinely cope with the I don't know. So in interviewer-based surveys, this is easier to deal with. You can deliver the survey to minimize the no opinion option, but still have it available depending on the respondent. But on the pen and paper or internet ones, you just have to choose one or the other, whether you're going to be exhaustive or whether you want to force people into an opinion and be willing to take missing data if people just don't answer the question. That's just a decision you have to make. The second disadvantage is that respondents can choose conveniently, especially if you have a battery of questions. People can just get lazy, bored, or quick in their responses to these, especially if the survey is long. That's why you, one, want to minimize the survey, and two, think about the survey's layout in order to minimize this kind of a problem, that people are just choosing the first one, just choosing however they want to. All right. So these are the types of questions that you can ask. Let me spend some time on the types of questions that you want to avoid. The first type that you want to avoid are double negative questions. So this uses two negatives to emphasize a point where only one is necessary. So for example, do you not approve of tax reforms? This is a problem because you don't really, if you agree, are you agreeing to not approving? Or are you agreeing to that you like tax reforms? A double negative makes it very confusing to say yes or no, or even to do a scale kind of response on them. So, do you agree with tax reforms? Do you approve of tax reforms? That's a much better way to word that type of a question. The second type of questions to avoid are double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is an informal fallacy. So this is committed when someone asks a question that touches upon more than one issue, but only allows for one answer. So you end up with an inaccuracy in attitudes being measured for the question because the respondent can only answer one of the two questions, and on a survey they likely can't indicate which one is being answered. So here's the thing to look out for. If you're finding when you're writing a survey question that you put the word "and" in there, you probably want to look at it because it might be a double-barreled question. It's not a foolproof test, but you want to make sure that if you use the word "and", that you're not. So let me give you an example. Please agree or disagree with the following statement. Cars should be faster and safer. Okay, so if you wanted the cars to be faster, but you didn't care too much about safer, do you answer yes to that question or no to that question? Likewise, if you could care less about speed, but you want them safer, that's the problem, is the double-barreled question only gives you one answer, one response to basically two questions. If you agree to both parts or you disagree with both parts, that's great, but it makes it a confusing kind of a question. Another example is, how satisfied are you with your pay and your job conditions? Again, two different questions in the same. You want to make sure that you knock those kinds of problems out. They reduce your reliability, they reduce your validity. The third type of question are leading questions. These are questions that suggest the answer or contain the information that the examiner, the surveyor, the pollster is looking for. This is really easier if I just give you an example. So this question is an example of a leading question. You were at Duffy's bar on the night of July 15th, weren't you? So this suggests that the person was at Duffy's bar on the night in question. If you wanted to do this in a way that wasn't leading, you would say, where were you on the night of July 15th? A lot of times surveyors give away what they want, what their objective is in the lead into the question. Instead of saying, would you like to vote for President Obama in the 2012 election? You ask the question, who do you think you will vote for in the 2012 presidential election? That's the difference between the leading question, with the inserting the person, and the non-leading question of leaving it a bit open-ended. Or if you have I lost my brain place. If you have, for example, the fixed alternative questions, instead of having, will you vote for President Obama in the 2012 election, check yes or no, you would say, which of the following candidates are you most likely to cast your ballot for? President Obama, Sarah Palin, Mitt Romney, or Mike Huckabee, whatever. That's a better way to ask that kind of a question. You want to minimize those kinds of yes or no questions because they're typically a bit leading. So the form of the question, you just want to make sure doesn't lead the respondent to agree or disagree. This is one of the critical problems with the Daily Kos poll that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. The fourth type is the loaded question. This is also an informal fallacy that asks a question that presupposes something that hasn't either been proven or accepted by everyone involved. So it's a complex question. Most of the time, these loaded questions include some kind of controversial assertion or loaded language. This is often used so that the question limits direct replies to those that would serve the questioner's agenda. An example of this question is, and this is really the classic example, do you still beat your wife? So whether the respondent answers yes or no, first, they admit to having a spouse. Second, they admit to having beat them at some point in the past. So they're kind of in a lose-lose kind of a situation. You don't want to design these kinds of questions in a poll, so you cannot presuppose facts with the question. It narrows the respondent to a single answer, and the respondent probably can't answer well. Odds are that the person would just skip that on a survey. Only when someone uses these kinds of presuppositions on things that have actually been established. For example, if you're only polling Democrats, you can assume that they're Democrats. Great. But you can't assume who they voted for president. That's the type of thing that you have to think about. You want to make sure that you're not asking questions that assume too much of your respondents in terms of information, who they are, etc. The final kind of bad question that we want to avoid are burdensome questions. Bottom line, people have faulty memories. So if a subject isn't really recent, then our memories are fairly unreliable. The cognitive burden that is placed on asking people to recall information can be reduced by using specific reference points. So, for example, you don't want to say, what did you have for dinner on August 15th, 2007? If you're interested in people's typical food consumption habits. What you would want to ask is something more along the lines of, what kind of dinner, or what is a dinner that you've had in the last week? If you're looking for typical behaviors, ask for something more recent and also put a time limiter on there. You want to be as concrete as possible, and you want to help out your respondents to be able to think of where they were, what they were doing, what they believe, and how things have changed. So be careful about asking people too much about what they've been doing all the time in great detail. Most of the time, we're interested in current beliefs, current habits, things like that. Frame your question that way, and you'll get much better results. So these are the types of questions you can ask, with the open and the closed-ended questions, also the types of questions you want to avoid. So when it comes to then sequencing your question, figuring out what you want to do with them, there are 4 issues to think about. First is order bias. Primacy and recency can affect the way that we deal with and retrieve our thoughts. So primacy effects, those are the things that are mentioned first, that gets preferred. Primacy effects tend to happen more in written surveys. The first mentioned response often gets more votes. So that's why even on a simple election ballot, between ballot to ballot, you'll see the respondents or the candidates listed in a different order. You should do that in your surveys as well if you're giving out written surveys. You should vary up the A, B, C, and D, or whatever your fixed alternatives are, so that people across your sample aren't all seeing the same first answer. That minimizes the primacy effects in written surveys. Recency effects happen more in phone surveys. So what this means is that the last thing you mention gets more votes. Again, this is because you hear the survey question and the last thing is what sticks in your mind. And so you're like, and then you say the last thing you said, the blah, blah, blah. What you want to do, again, is to make sure that you mix up the order of your questions in order to minimize the order bias. Second, you definitely want to include a funnel technique overall. Start with broader, easy questions, and then move over the course of your survey to more specific or detailed questions. This helps you acclimate the respondent and also minimize the bias of the responses. Once you introduce the broad topic, then you can narrow it. So if you think about the first question should be related to the topic, quick, and applicable to everybody. That's the idea with the funnel technique. Third, you need to make sure that you have filter questions in there. You want to make sure that you get the respondents that are qualified to answer. So you want to make sure that you include some filter questions at the very beginning of the survey to make sure it's worth the respondent's time and your time to ask and answer. And then finally, you want to also have pivot questions. Filter questions that are, what these are, the pivot questions are filter questions that are used to determine on which version of a second question that a respondent might be asked. So maybe you have different questions for men and women, for Democrats and Republicans, or whatever the different groups that might be targeted by your poll. So if you have a particular question that says, if they select A, then they go down these 5 questions. If they select B, they go down those 5 questions. That's simply what a pivot question is. Now, remember one of the principles that I talked about was keeping your respondents interested and really engaged in the survey. So the next topic is preventing respondent fatigue. So the first part of this is maximizing respondent motivation. How do you motivate the respondents? First, keep the questionnaire short. Place your most important questions early. Second, make sure you describe the value of the study. If they are doing something they think is valuable, they're going to participate and they're going to be much more willing to hang in with it. Third, provide clear instructions to help them think carefully. Fourth, obtain their commitment. Make them commit either verbally or on paper that they're going to be they're interested and they're willing to spend the time. It's a sales technique, but one that's actually really helpful in getting people to participate and stay with studies. Next, give booster instructions throughout the poll. Every new page, if it's pen and paper, every new screen, if it's the internet, and periodically, if it's a verbal kind of a survey, give booster instructions. Remind the respondent what they should be doing. And then occasionally include random probes. Ask why, basically from time to time. This will help keep people interested, keep people motivated. The second way that you want to prevent respondent fatigue is to minimize the task difficulty. This includes text labels. Don't just express numbers, scales 1 through 10. Put the words on there that you think make it most relevant. Keep the wording short. Use plain English. Focus on things that are interesting in the here and the now. Only ask about one idea per question. You want to make sure that you keep it focused. Keep scales simple and exhaustive. And ask for absolute, not relative judgments. Don't ask them to compare a whole bunch of things, but just to say whether one thing is good, bad, or indifferent. Makes it a lot simpler and a lot easier. And the final thing that I want to talk about is reviewing the questionnaire. Before you go into the field to conduct the study, first you have got to pre-test this with the population. That's actually where we're going to stop with our project for the semester, is just after the pre-test. Your final paper is really what would come next, the proposal for the big whole study based on the results of your pre-test. Second, check your spelling. There is nothing worse than sending out a survey with a bunch of spelling errors. One, it's not professional. Two, it's not professional. Three, what you really want to make sure is that it looks slick, clean, elegant. You don't want to give the participants any reason to think that you're not a serious, good scholar. So that's an important component of it. Third, check your scales. Having the anchors, for example, strongly agree, disagree, blah, blah, blah. This is really important. I was conducting a survey, it's been about, 8-9 years ago. And we had the survey laid out just fine. We popped it out of my laptop and printed it on someone else's computer, and the scale labels went away. So I had the scale ranking things 1 through 7 and no indicator as to which was the high end and which was the low end, the agree versus the disagree end. The survey went out to about 20 people before we caught it. That is perplexing. We caught it, we got everything corrected on it, and it didn't end up hurting it in the end. But one, it's a bit embarrassing when you do that, and two, you really risk your data being completely corrupted if you don't do that. So it's making sure that you've checked, rechecked, and once you print it out or post it online, that everything looks right. And then finally, speaking of being online, if you're doing your survey online, do technical checks. Make sure that it runs the way that you think it ought to. So, I know that's a lot of information, and this is probably going to be our last week of really kind of heavy lecture information, but I thought that this was really the best way to sum up the big picture. So, of putting together the surveys and giving a lot of what I think are best practices. And most of these are mentioned in your text, but it's in one condensed kind of format. So remember, most of your test questions are going to be from the lecture. There's still going to be test questions out of the text this week. But if you need to, go back and listen to different details, different slides based on what you got. And if you have questions, let me know. Have a good one, everyone.